how many of you were able to read the paper that Emily and Chris put out. Chris Jordan, our next speaker, Dr. Chris Jordan, put out the National Plan for Climate Action Plan using beavers, and it's a wonderful transition to bring Dr. Chris Jordan up here to address that specifically. Dr. Chris Jordan is a research fisheries biologist who thinks about how rewilding riverscapes will benefit humans, fish, beavers, and trees. So give a round of applause for Chris Jordan.
This is a horrible position to be following Emily. I am not going to be as entertaining. I'm not going to speak as fast. I'm not going to have any data and not so many pretty pictures. Because I want to tell actually what I think is a really depressing story, but I also want to try to put some hope into the messaging that we're getting about climate change. It's doom, it's gloom, it's disaster. There's nothing we can do. I think there is actually something to do. Well, not us, but we can facilitate nature-based solutions, beaver-based solutions, with respect to climate change. So think about what this title proposes. Think about what the content of this essay that Adam said that Emily and I produced recently. Here's a global problem that's centuries old, and our solution is a rodent. So I'll just leave that. We'll come back to that. See whether you buy it or not. Okay, technology. All right. So climate change. We've already heard about fire as a feature of our land mismanagement, centuries of land mismanagement, exacerbated by climate change, atmospheric drying, overstocked forests, fire suppression. This, atmospheric drying, water mismanagement. This, droughts. Land simplification, climate change, manipulating biological systems. We end up with landscapes and riverscapes overrun by invasive species. That changes their potential. That changes their biological potential, their natural potential, and that changes their potential to deliver ecosystem services. So in our human-centric world, we often say, or human-centric view of the world, we say, what can you, nature, do for me? And that's the ecosystem services. And systems that are dominated by fire, by drought, by invasive species, are not delivering their biological potential for their natural reasons that they exist, but then also from our perspective, they aren't as useful. And that all of a sudden motivates us to do something about it. Riverscapes, I think, have the worst of the worst in that we have mistreated our riverscapes for centuries, and climate change is making that situation much worse. So these are what I call the sort of the four truths. They aren't pretty, of riverscapes in climate change world. Riverscape degradation and simplification is the rule. Most river systems, most riverscapes across the planet have been simplified and degraded. Streams, rivers, and floodplains are so exploited that they aren't even delivering our human-centric services. These simplified streams, rivers, and floodplains have a dramatically reduced capacity to deliver biological and ecosystem services, both for nature and for humans. And piling on top of that, climate change has changed their ability to be resilient. And that's a natural feature. These are self-repairing systems, and climate change has taken that away. That is, we've gotten away with degrading these systems for a long time. There was that headroom for us to extract and modify and carry on. We've run out of that headroom, and climate change is eating into that as well. That's what's giving us this crisis. This crisis has been building for a long time, and we've known it's been building, but now it's really time to pay that debt. So this is my message. And so at this point I could stop here, and I would be adding to the doom and gloom of all the climate change messaging. Because I've just made your morning really bad after you listened to Emily, and I'm not giving you any hope. I'll keep going. All right. So we have really simplified our systems. We view riverscapes as conveyance systems, moving water across a landscape, moving it to someplace else, dumping stuff in to have it carried away, because that's really convenient because gravity and all that ability of water to carry stuff away. Water is all over the place, and we realize because of gravity, we can move that water around to dry out land. So we've changed even the physics of those watersheds, for our benefit. We've hardened the landscape. Water moves stuff around, but in cities, we don't want it to move around. And so we've armored everything around our built environment so that rivers and streams and floodplains can't do what they normally do. And that's move sediment, move substrate, move biological material around. That's sort of the geomorphic work of a river system. And we don't like that. It's inconvenient. We do our landscape practices, so our extractive, in this case, our forestry industry, and gravity does its job of carrying stuff, in this case, a lot of fine sediment down into our river systems. Naturally, river systems carry sediment off of the hill slope, sort it, pile it up, and every once in a while we find something useful in that pile of gravel, in this case, gold. And so we mix and dredge through all of that substrate, all of that sediment to pull the gold out and leave these piles of whatever's left behind, because it doesn't matter. It's just a valley bottom. But now its function is completely changed. It's now out of the reach of the river. The physics that made that was over millions of years, and our application of diesel undid that in years or tens of years. There's a biological function in these rivers. Beaver, for example. And for hundreds of years, we removed them because we found valuable their pelts. We've misapplied our science, our understanding of these river systems. The idea that river systems are meant to convey water has entered into our science and then into our culture through our science, and everyone wants to do something about it. And the idea that we need to help these systems by cleaning them up. And so these are pictures of stream cleaning, which is misapplied ideas about what should be in river systems, handed to very well-meaning people to help out nature, to get all that messy stuff out of the stream. Which means we end up with these simple systems. They might be attractive from the sky. They might make beautiful photos. They might sort of feel natural because they're these nice curves, and it's all bright green. But these are really, really simplified, degraded systems. These are very unhealthy, simplified systems. These are rivers that are disconnected from their floodplain. There's a very distinct difference between the dry land and then the wet land. Whereas before, there was a connection between the floodplain and the river. And what I want to talk about is how do we reestablish that connection, and what does that do for climate change? Emily talked about what does that do for fire behavior, fire fighting. But we can make this even bigger. We've lost that connected system. We've lost those connected floodplains where it's hard to tell where this river starts and ends and where the forest starts and ends, because there isn't just a single channel. This is a corridor of wetlands or a river of dams. Where is the river here? Where's the channel? What would you float down if you were going to raft a river? Because that's what rivers are for. They're for recreation. How would you get from the lower right to the upper left, which is downhill in this case? Is it, or is the water flowing the other way? This doesn't look like a river, but this is what rivers and streams and floodplains look like before we turn them into what we think of them now. So let's think about this connection between riverscapes and climate change, and disconnected floodplains versus connected floodplains, and put us in the language of climate response, climate change response, adaptation and mitigation. And some of the features that we think of that are delivered by systems and have been impaired, like water temperature, and the difference between a disconnected floodplain and a connected floodplain. You have much more homogeneous water temperature. There aren't ponds, there aren't shallow areas and deep areas, and so the water temperature is all much more similar, and it tends to be warmer. And from a biological perspective, this is a uniform habitat, and in this case, a warmer habitat. That uniformity means there's no options for anything that lives in that system. There's no way that fish can be behaviorally thermoregulate, that can move from a warm area to a cool area. Those options have been taken away by that simplification. So reconnecting floodplains adds that complexity back. That's an adaptation. That's something that we can do. We can pitch it as an adaptation, but really this is just a returning these natural solutions, these natural states to where they were before. We can think about those in multiple dimensions. So water temperature, carbon storage. There'll be talks about carbon storage from Beaver systems in this meeting. We can talk about flood mitigation in terms of water storage and adaptations from droughts. So this is water storage on a small scale. We're not changing precipitation patterns, but changing where water goes and how it's stored and delivered across the landscape, and the dramatic difference between a connected floodplain and a disconnected floodplain. And if all of our world now are these disconnected floodplains, we've lost all of these abilities for connected floodplains to help either mitigate or give us adaptations in this changing climate. So how do we do this? How do we think about moving from our disturbed landscape, our less resilient landscape, to something that is actually more resistant to inevitability of climate change? Well, I'd like you to go through this exercise to even just think about what rivers look like. So close your eyes. You can fall asleep. If you close your eyes, you can't see the rest of the slide, so maybe in your mind, close your eyes. And I want to take you through an exercise that was done at a meeting of aquatic biologists a few years ago, which was to do just this. Imagine that you were in charge of a restoration program, and this was your stream. This was a straightened stream, and that your job was to restore this stream. And what you're going to do is you're going to draw that picture of a restored stream on a 3x5 card. And that's what happened at this meeting. These are all professionals. These are aquatic biologists. They were all given a 3x5 card, asked this question. Here's a simplified straight stream. Draw me a restored stream. And this is a test, without people realizing they were taking a test, is what's in their mind's eye of a healthy stream. And sadly, this is what they drew. 90% or so decided to take this really bad straight stream and make it really good wiggly ditch. That is not a connected floodplain. That is not a healthy system. But this is the science community given the chance to demonstrate their understanding of the difference between a disconnected floodplain system and a connected floodplain system. And they failed. That's the basis of knowledge in our community about how to solve this problem. Now, I think all of you would have passed this test because you're coming at it from this Beaver perspective, where you drop into a stream and it's impaired versus where it's covered with Beaver. It doesn't look like this because Beaver they add something to the system. This is a physics-dominated system. This is what a system looks like if you take the biology out. And what we're talking about is putting the biology back so that you have the physics of the system being balanced by the biology. So what does that look like when you have those? You end up with these ribbons of floodplains. You end up with systems where, again, it's hard to tell where the stream ends and where the uplands begin. Sorry, that was me. You end up with systems, again, where it's hard to tell what is a stream and what is not. And this is what we've forgotten. We've forgotten what these systems look like, and therefore we as a society are not thinking what we can use or what we have lost from these systems. And in this case, in terms of climate change, we have lost this resilience, we've lost this buffering that helps us and it helps the natural world deal with the climate changing situation. How does this work? So here's an example from Ellen Wool's work. So this is Lauren Wool paper recently, where they were asking the question around carbon storage in these connected versus simplified systems. So you have a complex system where you have a balance of the biology and the physics, and you have a simplified system, so if it's unbalanced. In this case, the physics is winning. And in those sort of physics-winning simplified systems, you're going to have, sorry, I can't see the screen. You have this floodplain disconnection, so you have a sort of a drier floodplain, single channel, and that's going to, mean keeping the water in channel. There's no water flowing out of the banks at high flows, and that is a feedback by the water staying in the channel. It has a chance to be cutting down, which further disconnects the system. And this is a physics-dominated circuit here, where the unbalance is between sort of the physical drivers and the biological resistance to those drivers. And you end up with a simplified system, and by simple I mean it's a single channel. There aren't this complexity of channels, and there aren't a complexity of characteristics of that system. When you add the biology in, so the biology and the physics are in a sense competing with each other, now you have things like beaver dams. You have structure. It could be trees, it could be sedges, but you have some structure in there, and now that structure is fighting the moving water, and that results in if you have some dams in the system, that's going to back water up. Water is going to spread out. That's going to make more food or more space. You might get more beaver dams, and now you end up with this feedback circuit, which is pushing you and maintaining. Most importantly, is pushing a system. If you start from a simple and becomes complicated, that's the driver, and once it's there, that's the maintenance contract, which keeps a complex system in that complex state. So let's look at some examples here. Here's a system that has beaver, that has plants. So here's the biology, right? There's riparian vegetation. This is not a cow-dominated system. There are beaver, so here's a beaver dam. But in this case, the physics is winning. In this case, the geomorphic work that the stream channel is able to do cannot be balanced by the biological work that the plants and animals can do. And in this case, this is and really what I'm talking about is a battle between the sun and between gravity. Solar input is driving all of the biology. It's driving the plant growth, which is feeding beaver. So this is the biological inputs to the system. And that's being resisted by gravity, water flowing downhill. And the fact that water has viscosity, which means it can grab onto things and take it with it. So it can cause erosion. So viscosity and gravity fighting the sun. When they are in an equal sort of, they're collaborating, or they're equally strong, you have this complicated system where you have that balance. Where one of them is winning, you have a simplified system. And it can be dominated by plants, or it can be dominated by the gravity and viscosity. And this, most of the time we see that sort of geomorphic winning side of the unbalance. And this is a simple system. This cannot be anything but a simple channel. If those systems are in balance, then they can start collaborating. So here's a system where the water is being spread out, so it has space to spread out, but in spreading out, it's watering up all of this ground and causing plants to grow. And this is just one growing season after the water was spread out here. Now that these plants in the system are growing, that's adding more resistance. And this is where the feedback happens. So this resistance is going to keep in a sense, the geomorphic work from taking over. Now you have this balance between the sun input, the biology, and the geomorphic resistance in trying to cut and move things around. That balance, and this is just one example of that kind of a balance, that balance is what forces that complexity and maintains that complexity. So from a climate change perspective, and let's get back to climate change and beaver. From a climate change perspective, those complex systems are what are going to deliver the services that we would like to see. Adaptation and mitigation kind of services. And beaver is that biological driver that allows to go from the simple systems here where you have degraded river systems that stay degraded because erosion doesn't necessarily have any balance, because of water temperature homogeneity and warming of water there's no variability in that water depth, or no ability to force water from the surface into the groundwater in the simplified systems. In the complex systems where you have that balance between the physics and the biology, you end up with all of these potential services that come from these connected floodplains. And those are the climate change tools. Those are the pieces of climate mitigation and adaptation that we are hoping that we as humans can apply to benefit us, right? So we're again back to benefiting us. So let's look at some how this works and how beaver can change things on a landscape scale. Here's a forest in Oregon. In this case, this here is a simplified system, single channel. And you might argue that this is either out of balance as too much biology because of trees shading and not allowing any beaver food, or the physics is out of balance in terms of have a simplified single channel. In either case, the ability for this channel to be complex and make an open, complex floodplain is modified and impaired. And I would argue in this particular case, because of a lack of sunlight, because of the trees in a sense holding the system together. And again, the physics is keeping this into a simplified system. Just upstream of this this is alder forest, is in the same gradient, same valley width, is a beaver complex. And all of the trees, as beaver have taken over, have died and opened up the floodplain, and you have a complex connected floodplain system. So as Emily was pointing out with her fire examples, when we're looking on a landscape scale and we see these convenient examples, we have to think about what is actually the difference, and are we really controlling for the difference to claim our observations from sort of these natural experiments. So here we go. Here's our natural experiment. Beaver have moved into an area with a simplified channel and a full forest canopy. They cannot modify this channel. They can't get the services that we want out of a connected floodplain until they're actually able to make multiple channels and open up this as a connected floodplain system. The only way that can happen is in the absence of the forest itself. And we can watch that happen just downstream. So here is, in the sunlight area, here is that open floodplain where the alder have died from the beaver, and they're starting to move downstream. Here's a beaver dam, and killing off the trees and opening up the forest themselves. This is a large river system in Oregon. This is the John Day River system in Oregon. And what I'd like to end with is the idea that our beaver-dominated river systems are limited to the places where beaver can actually take over the physics of the river. So it's a small enough system where beaver can take over and help take over the physics. If we ask the question, how much of a watershed is sort of beaver controllable? Because there is some skepticism that I started with that a rodent is going to help us solve this problem. Where on our river systems are rodents actually going to be able to take over? Beaver dam-sized changes to the physics of a system is going to be only in those sort of smaller streams where they can actually dam and affect and move the water around. But in reality, most of the landscape are those smaller streams. So here is just the proportion of watersheds that are large rivers and moving up the hierarchy to the smallest sort of perennial streams. And the vast majority of streams, and here's just one example watershed in Oregon, the vast majority of those streams are these smallest streams that sort of penetrate into the forest. And so beaver are living in these fourth to first order streams and actually able to build dams and take over those river systems. And so the idea that a beaver can actually contribute to make landscape change is real when we think about not modifying these large rivers, but those large rivers make such a small fraction of all the rivers possible. And so here's beaver are actually controlling most of our landscape. And the last thing that I want to leave you with is, again, back to thinking about trees. So here are two pictures, and this is in the Cascades, so in the wet forest of Oregon. A photo from the 1920s and 30s to a photo now taken in the same place. And I'd like you to look at the two photos and the difference in the tree cover. And by a show of hands or shouting out, which of these do you think is more representative of a historic condition? So again, thinking about smallest watersheds penetrating up into the forest. And while we're looking at mountain areas, we are looking at areas that are impacted by beaver behavior in those small streams. So this is when we connect back to trees and the connection between the health of watersheds and what we expect sort of our natural tree, our natural forest conditions. So any thoughts on this? Hands up for the 1930s, sort of tree stand density being what you'd expect more, or the more recent time. So we think of the Pacific Northwest as the land of trees, of forests. That's what this looks like. But less than 100 years ago, there was a pretty different picture. So let me see a show of hands. Are we thinking of that sort of 1930s level and before as being a healthy forest? I see a small number of hands. Are we thinking here in the 2000s as being a healthy forest? About the same number of hands. And so what we're seeing here as a result of fire suppression and industrial forestry is the filling in of open space with trees. And we're seeing the same thing if we look at these watersheds, that we view these healthy watersheds as being fully treed. But in reality, these large-scale disturbances like beaver here, removing trees throughout the watersheds, and fire here, removing the trees throughout the watershed, as being a closer balance of vegetation and the structure of these watersheds. And when we ask the questions, how do we want to get these ecosystem services? How are we going to get climate resilience out of watersheds? We tend to ask it and focus, even as I started with beaver, on the watersheds itself. But if we see these small streams where we can have beaver penetrating into the landscape everywhere, there's really no disconnect between the landscapes and the riverscapes, and fighting climate change just in the valley bottoms, just on the riverscape scale, is going to be a battle against our history of land mismanagement in terms of forestry, and it's going to have to be a collaboration between the two in order for us to actually make this rodent-driven plan work. And I'm going to stop there. Thank you.